Thank you everyone for joining. We'll get started. My name is Mariam and I'm a volunteer at Amend. I know for some people in this call it will be the first time joining a Amend event, so I'm just going to provide a brief background about Amend to help everyone have a better understanding of today's webinar. First of all, MEND stands for Muslim Engagement and Development, and it's a not-for-profit company that helps to encourage British Muslims with local communities to be more actively involved in British media and politics. A few ways we aim to achieve this is through our Islamophobia response unit, which helps victims of Islamophobia to report hate crimes and Islamophobic incidents. In addition to this, we have our policy team who do an outstanding job on developing policy and educational materials. And we also have our community team who work towards the grassroots side of our work. We engage with our local community to empower media and political literacy. The purpose of today's webinar is to raise awareness about Islamophobia in schools. With a detrimental rise in Islamophobic hate crimes and discrimination, schools and educational institutions have become an imperative platform through which Islamophobia can either be tackled or perpetrated. From analysing the recent statistics, the data shows 185 extra reports of Islamophobia since September 2020 in schools and schools alone. Bearing in mind these are the only reported statistics. A small portion of Islamophobic incidents were in relation to the lack of prayer facilities within schools. A disappointing factor here, considering prayer facilities provide benefits for both students and the schools, which we'll touch on in a minute. In light of this, we are very excited to be launching our first easy read guide focusing on prayer spaces in schools, which is a booklet that essentially covers how a prayer space is beneficial in schools, what the UK's constitutional position is, and what this means for schools, and how we can put this into practice. Prayer is a fundamental part of Islam, and supporting Muslim students to pray in schools allows them to develop their religious identities with confidence and feel secure in their positions as members of society. In this webinar, we'll only explain our first easy read guide in detail. However, we are proud to be launching 3 more easy read guides in future, covering halal school dinners, wearing the hijab, and fasting in schools. Definitely something we should all be keeping an eye out, as it has so many benefits. Without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker, Samir Rafiq. Samir is a junior researcher at Men's Policy Team and was a great contributor to the first easy read guide focusing on prayer spaces. Good evening, Samir. How are you?
I am good. That's a very kind introduction, Mariam. Thank you. I'm well.
So thank you for joining us today. I'm eager to hear more about the easy read guide. Tell me everything.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. And so yeah, this easy read guide is really on the back of the reports that the IRU have received with parents and students complaining about the lack of prayer spaces in schools. And I remember the policy team received a memo from the IRU requesting some kind of a guide that would really equip parents and children with the knowledge and with the background that they would need in order to go to schools and say, we need these spaces. This case involved a parent who contacted the school for a reasonable prayer space, but the school refused on the basis that they were not a faith school, and also that there wasn't adequate space or staff to supervise, which is a bit of a recurring thing with these cases. And another one, which is it's quite sad really, because this school did allow for the space to pray and the school's entire ground hall was being used. However, upon new management, the head teacher decided to ban Friday prayers. And this resulted in students literally praying in anywhere, any space they could find, including praying outside. And British weather isn't the most reliable, so no matter what the weather was, they would still be praying outside. And the students did take initiative, so they contacted their school student counsellor, who refused, and still the request was refused. So these are some of the cases that the IIU has received, and this was really the inspiration behind this prayer space in schools easy read guide. I know that there has been a link in the chat for the easy read guide, but I do want to take you guys through just very briefly the kind of processes that we went through in order to select the right kind of information to put on there so that parents and students will really have something to hand when they needed to speak to their schools. So we really started off by discussing how prayer space is beneficial, because we want to make the case that it's going to be positive towards the students' growth and learning. And we put forth as a multi-faith prayer school, so that, you know, it's inclusive and that it allows space for everyone to come and pray. And the benefits of having a designated prayer space, or even having somewhere that they can reflect and you know, as Muslims, it's really important for us to have that opportunity to pray, as Mariam really said. So that was what we have started up on. But then we come to the part which we felt was really important to mention, and that's kind of, what does the law say? Because, you know, the lack of prayer spaces and the need for prayer spaces is really backed up by the law. And there is a duty upon the school to adhere to the Equality Act. And, you know, that's kind of a major part of this easy read guide. And it's in, you know, it's in an accessible form, so that parents and students are able to take it and say to them, look, you know, you are bound by the Equality Act to give us this space. And so that was something we really wanted to ensure. And we've kind of described what this means for the schools as well, like, you know, what is their duty, and to be very explicit on what can be expected from them by these students, really. And, you know, what's a guide without how to put it into practice? So we do have information on sort of best practices and examples of, you know, primary schools or schools that are successfully providing their students with prayer spaces, and how they have really created such a positive environment for these students through that. And these schools are not necessarily faith schools, they are non-faith schools as well. And that really helps to kind of showcase and highlight how schools are really, some schools are really going out of their way to, you know, to enable this for Muslim students or students in general, although it's not something they should be doing extra anyway. It's part of their duty as schools and as providers. And we also give examples of secondary schools who are also doing that. That's really great. So of course the question comes, what about COVID-19? Surely it's reasonable for schools to say COVID-19, we can't, you know, we can't control what would happen, it's not safe. And we also give schools, and we also give parents and students kind of the background on, you know, how that could be managed as well, which is really important, because we are going to be continually going forward in a sort of post-pandemic world. But we also offer suggestions of what parents and students can do if schools are not providing that for them, and what avenues they can take, including getting in touch with Men's Islamophobia Response Unit, but also approaching those that are in charge and those that will that should be listening. So yes, that's kind of the breakneck speed rundown of the guide. I really hope that it's, you know, useful. We hope that it's useful, and we really look forward to providing more of these. Thank you for the time. It's been really wonderful to be here. Thank you. Over to you, Mario.
Thank you, Samir. Definitely very useful, and thank you for all your hard work helping to put the Easy Read Guide together. It honestly looks amazing and extremely beneficial for many schools across the UK. It will definitely make a positive impact for countless Muslim students dreaming to pray at school. It's something that I can personally relate to. My first secondary school didn't have a prayer room, but when I moved school for sixth form, it did. And having a prayer room genuinely feels refreshing. Praying is one thing, but being able to pray on time feels even better. I'm overjoyed for the children who will benefit from having a prayer facility in school. It's not only for the children currently in school, but also for the new generation to come, therefore creating long-term change. Thank you for all your efforts, Samir. I look forward to reading the new Easy Read guides in future. Moving on to our second guest speaker, who has had a remarkable life experience so far, where she was a teaching assistant at a school in Birmingham. She was shockingly sacked for objecting 11-year-olds being shown graphic footage of the 9/11 attacks. She then boldly took her case to the employment tribunal, where successfully claiming an unfair dismissal. Her journey did not end there. She achieved a BA from Magdalen College in Oxford University in 2014, a master's from SOAS University in London in 2015, and smashing it through, completing her PhD at UCL and Yale in 2019, and now is a parliamentary researcher. Please welcome Dr. Samir Rafiq.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us, Samir.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. And thank you so much for Samiha's presentation. I really enjoyed it. Very insightful, and I think material that is much needed in today's educational landscape and teaching resources for both teachers and parents, actually. So I really like that it's representative, kind of showing what we really ought to be considering in today's kind of contemporary COVID and pandemic kind of world. So as you rightly mentioned, I do have personal experiences of discrimination, but I would particularly like to bring in my experience of my research experiences in particular, and I'm just going to upload a presentation which will hopefully show this in more detail. I can't seem to find the share. Oh, I can now. Sorry. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yep, we can.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll start off. Today's presentation is on, well, I've titled it Muslims, Faith and Education in Britain, Research Insights and Personal Experiences. So yeah, like you mentioned earlier, I do have personal experience of discrimination within the legal, within the educational sphere in the classroom, and did take that to court. Aspects of that is still ongoing, which I'll touch on at a later point in today's presentation. As an overview to begin this presentation, I want to introduce and share insights as to experiences of Muslim students. So that's quite important, I think, to ground what we know about education and the British Muslim student experience through the lens of research. Research is really important, and it's what I do as an academic, first and foremost. And I will share personal experiences, but I also want to caveat that there is a lot of good things that are going on in schools. And today's presentation is not a criticism of all teachers everywhere. When I previously speak and have spoken about some of the research that I've conducted, and even my own experiences, and in and amongst the audience is often teachers, and they do tense up a little bit to say, well, this is not, you know, your experience is quite rare, and it's an anomaly, which in some places I'm sure it absolutely is, but we cannot deny that there's a pattern that we're seeing in terms of Islamophobia and experiences of Islamophobia by younger students, and students particularly in secondary school, primary school ages, and we're all pretty kind of, I'm sure we know about the PREVENT strategy, which I won't really be talking about today. It's not my research forte, my research expertise, but you know, a lot of us are aware of PREVENT, and younger students, primary school is younger 4 and 5, being referred to PREVENT for bringing toys into school that, you know, are viewed and perceived in a suspicious way. For instance, we've seen those reports in the media, for example. And I will also make some comments as to the future of education of British Muslims, but today's presentation is really about providing a landscape of current experiences, contemporary experiences, and highlighting some of the research. And perhaps in the Q&A, we can go into talking about the future of education for British Muslims collectively, as opposed to me just kind of giving my individual opinions and viewpoints. So in terms of first research, kind of research insights, I want to highlight a paper that I published last year in the Journal of Muslim Minority Studies, titled Double-Edged Panopticons, which focuses on the experiences of students in the aftermath of the Trojan horse affair. Now, many of us will be familiar with the so-called Trojan horse affair scandal, but at the same time, a lot of us may not be. So just for those who are not familiar with the Trojan horse affair scandal, it was a so-called Islamist, inverted commas, Islamist plot by right-wing extremist Muslims, again, inverted commas, to take over British state schools in the city of Birmingham, UK. It was largely covered in the media, and you know, from local authorities to national government, kind of the Department of Education, for instance. At the time, Michael Gove was leading that, and it really politicized the city of Birmingham and its Muslims in particular, so much so that Fox News had put out a clip. A news anchor had described Birmingham, the city of Birmingham, being Muslim only, and that non-Muslims were not allowed to enter. Completely erroneous, completely false claims that were being made, but it goes to show how much the so-called scandal politicized Birmingham and its Muslims on an international scale, and it underscores the way that Birmingham's Muslim community was under the international lens and therefore international scrutiny, and under that microscope really as to what was going on at the level of the school. What it did plant in the hearts of the nation and even international audiences is that there's possible jihad or Islamic extremism going on in British, so-called British schools, and that it really honed in on the idea that every student as young as 11 could be a potential terrorist, and that, I think, seeing that in the national media and Birmingham's Muslims being under the magnifying glass in that way, and by default, by extension, Muslims in Britain more broadly, was actually quite devastating. And it was devastating for the students in particular at the schools that were involved in this alleged scandal. And my research was the first research project that looked into, and it's currently the only research project that looks at the experiences of the students who studied at the school. A lot of the narratives around the Trojan horse affair were from the government's narratives, or they were from the teachers' narratives, who were treated quite awfully, actually. They didn't really get their day in court, I don't think. And it was all kind of from adults' perspectives, the news media as well, but very rarely did we see the experiences of the students who studied at the school. And so this research project looked at and interviewed school students at one of the schools, and the school has to remain anonymous due to data protection. But it was one of the numerous, one of several schools that were involved in the alleged plot in Birmingham. And so I interviewed 7 students, and And they told me things like they felt school felt like a prison to them. Had a constant feeling of being watched by teachers, governors, media crews, and the world, because media crews were inside and outside the schools. They were given a free pass to roam around the school, and they couldn't understand why their permission was not sought from them to be filmed. And one student particularly drew contrast to school prospectuses and kind of activity days and trips where the school would send out permission slips, permission letters to all parents, and ask them for permission for their children's photos to be taken and included in the school prospectus. And so one of the students said, well, if they could do that for school prospectus, why was our privacy kind of completely overridden when it came to the Trojan Horse Fair and media advertisement and media coverage? And it really underscored the way that it was no longer about individual students. It was no longer about individual rights. It was about Muslims as potential terrorists, and all kind of privacy under 16 restrictions and guidelines really went out the window. And so it goes a long way to show the way that students are treated, and especially if they're Muslim in this country. Students also experience high levels of anxiety and depression about their future due to the media representation. Many of them said, well, I don't think I'm ever going to get into college. I don't think I'm going to get a university place, because as soon as they see the school name on my CV, they're going to completely reject my application because of the media and the media representation about the school, even though the school had changed its name. Many of the schools had gone a complete revamp of their identity, of their values, of their kind of public image, and their uniforms as well. And relating to that point in particular, one of the students said that they felt like they could no longer be Muslim in the school. They had to leave their Muslimness at the doorstep of the school. And the reason they cited for this is that there was a lifelike cutout of St. George at the school reception to promote British values, which was not there prior to the scandal, and it was introduced as part of the revamp and the overhaul in terms of the school's image in the immediate aftermath of the Trojan Horse Fair scandal. And so as a result of that, that was an indication to them that they could no longer be Muslim in school. And so that is the deep level of psychological, mental, emotional impact that the Trojan Horse Affair had on students, and that's not even accounting for the education impact, because we all know the statistics. There was something like 95% A star to Cs prior to Trojan Horse Affair, and only 33% or around the 30% mark of passes in the immediate aftermath of the Trojan Horse Affair scandal. And so I termed and coined the term, I titled the paper and coined the term double-edged panopticons, based on Jeremy Bentham's and then later Michel Foucault's work on the panopticon, which was a circular type of watchtower, a circular type of prison model that had been designed at the time. And what I essentially am saying is that this panopticon central watchtower from within, from wherein officers watch all inmates, is not only a single kind of sided panopticon from within the watchtower, it's actually double-sided, because there's watchtower within the school and there's a watchtower outside the school in terms of the media crew. And so that's how it's become a double-edged panopticon. I won't get into the theory too much here, but that's the first research insight that I wanted to present from this project that I conducted in 2015 now. The second research insight that I want to present is employment experiences of Muslim women. This is a report launched titled Empowered Employment in 2020. In February, we launched this report in Parliament, and had a lot of support from parliamentarians and interest in kind of adjusting policies. And the reason that I present this particular research here in this forum today is because it is related to the school experience of students. A lot of the discrimination, a lot of the lack of confidence and opportunities that we're seeing women talk about at a later stage in their careers and in their adult lives actually begin at school, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So as I mentioned, we looked at employment experiences of Muslim women. We found high levels of Islamophobia and discrimination. So, and this was the largest study conducted into Muslim women's experiences. We had 425 women take the survey, and 50 one-to-one interviews were also conducted. 47.2% of women had said that they'd encountered Islamophobia and discrimination in the workplace. And in terms of the challenges that they experienced, 78% of women experienced more than one challenge in the workplace. And that was absolutely tremendous. On average, it was 2 or 3 challenges. And the challenges included the lack of opportunity, the lack of networking, and also a lack of confidence. We did find high levels of resilience amongst Muslim women. So for example, 42% received free school meals, 48.2% came from households below the average household income of 28,500. 48.2% had undergraduate degrees, and 84.2% were actively engaged in the labour market. So all really good signals and indications that Muslim women were doing well and had the potential to do well. But we did find a significant loss of aspiration and talent between the ages of 14 to 22. 79 women wanted to be doctors at the age of 14, but only 1 became a doctor at the age of 22. And women were entering highly gendered industries. In terms of the helpful resources, women wanted networking opportunities earlier in life. They also wanted mentoring, greater understanding from employees and workplaces as to their religious practices, greater understanding from colleagues, paid internships and work experience at a younger age, and a high level wanted mentoring and advice as well. But a lot of this due to the loss of aspiration and talent between the ages of 14 to 22, where sixth form and high school, secondary school take place. Really, a lot of the resources now need to be focused there so that women and men, young boys as well. Our next report will be focusing on Muslim men's experiences, and the research findings are similar. A lot of resources and time and effort needs to be kind of focused on in this area between the ages of 14 to 22. So your secondary schools, you know, your college and pre-university that timeline.
Yeah, definitely. Your research is definitely really interesting. I can see you've got one more slide. I think I'll need you to summarize the slide for me.
Okay, so in terms of the third research insight, we published a report in July titled The Equality Act 10 Years On. We listed a number of ways to improve the Act, including adding new protected characteristics. And we particularly argued that Section 9 of the Act should be amended to include racialized groups, which is currently not done so for Muslims. And so this would improve the current legal apparatus, affording protection for Muslims to seek justice in law. And I did want to touch upon personal experience, but we can do that maybe later in the Q&A.
Definitely, thank you so much. Your research is really interesting and definitely eye-opening, especially your point around students feeling like they have to leave their Muslim identities behind, because it truly does have a huge psychological effect, which will inevitably have an impact on student exams and their whole future. So I do hope your research continues and is used to make real change. And our final guest speaker we are delighted to have with us today is Karen Cohorn. Karen has carried out tremendous work on diversity and inclusion policies and is now working in the National Education Union, also known as the NEU. The NEU improve working lives through practical support and sharing views on policies and campaigns which shape government initiatives. This combined form, representing the entire education workforce, makes the NEU a powerful and persuasive voice with decision makers when championing the rights of education professionals and standing up for the education of students. Thank you so much for joining us today, Karen.
Thank you, Mariam, and thank you to the other two speakers, because it was so interesting to hear. I should say thank you to MEND as well, because the resources you're producing are fantastic, and we would like to share them widely with our teachers. As you say, our members are numerous. We've got 500,000 members, and that gives us tremendous reach, and we must use that reach for the benefit of all anti-racism and anti-Islamophobia. So first thing I want to say is that we're really concerned as a union at the insidious ways in—
Oh, you just put on mute, Karen.
I did that by accident, sorry.
All good, thank you.
Okay, we're concerned at the insidious ways in which Islamophobia is operating and intersecting at structural, community, cultural and interpersonal levels, and it's becoming part of the fabric of society. And we're really concerned that what happens is that also the international level is signaling a move to the right, and it's resulting in a resurgence of white supremacy. And this in turn leads to an increase of the normalization of Islamophobic hate speech and actions, just as we see happening in Palestine. So I wanted to just speak about those three levels I mentioned: the personal, the cultural and the structural. And it basically means that all instances of Islamophobia are connected. If you see one instance of Islamophobic comment, it's usually because there is a cultural context and a structural context to what happens. And at the personal or psychological level, that's where you really get people being prejudiced and saying hurtful things like, you know, all of the microaggressions, like go back to where you came from, or please don't use a bomb here. Those kind of microaggressions happen every day. And as Surya was saying, that the cumulative effect of all of those kind of microaggressions is real trauma for the child or young person. And that can lead to that child or young person feeling as though they don't belong, and that you know, the whole world is against them. What does that do for their education? So we're really concerned at how those little instances build up to the point at which that child or young person feels very disenfranchised from school and from society. And at the structural level, what's really, really important is that we look at what's happening nationally in terms of the government, what's happening in terms of the legislation, the securitization agenda, the whole British values agenda, which has been touched on already. And I used to be a governor of a school in which they, when they knew Ofsted were coming, ordered lanyards for all the young people, and around the lanyards they had the British values printed. So literally people were it was hung around their neck, the burden of was hung around their neck. And the British values, as you know, I won't go into the criticism of them, but they shouldn't be labelled British values. We should just have human rights values. And I don't actually agree with the tolerance one, because that one implies that there is a power relationship where you tolerate other people, you put up with them. So we really need to challenge on British values as well. We need to challenge all of the prevent agenda in schools. We know that education is responsible for most referrals to prevent, and only 5% of them ever end up going any further. So for the 95% of young people that have been referred to Channel, they're being stigmatized, and that experience will stay with them and further traumatize them. Another example of what happens at the structural level is the national curriculum, which doesn't actually reflect the way in which Muslim people around the world, the histories of Muslim people around the world, the achievements, the accomplishments, the cultures are not reflected in the national curriculum. And this term, we're launching a curriculum review campaign. The Welsh government have done it, and we want to do it here as well. And in Wales, they've also got a resource for secondary schools on tackling Islamophobia. And again, that's something that I think we would like to follow up on and work perhaps with MEND on trying to get some more resources for schools. So that's at the structural level. Also at the structural level is school policies, school leadership. What do the policies say about Islamophobic bullying? What do they say about hate crime? How are teachers responding to that? A problem identified very recently by the University College London in a report called Addressing Extremism Through the Classroom, found that teachers are not being given the time, training or resources to teach pupils about Islamophobia and extremism from the far right. So what happens is teachers do it in a very tokenistic or superficial way, and the curriculum is already crammed. So they have to think about ways to build it into existing lessons. And that's where I think we can be really helpful to them to say, well, this is a way that you can do it without adding to the curriculum, but build it into every subject. Every, sciences, not just history, not just English, but into every subject and every key stage. And what we found really is that schools play to Ofsted, and they tend to, like another school I know, were asked by Ofsted to monitor the prayer room to see who goes into the prayer room. And to their credit, the school said, we're not doing that. The prayer room is a sacred place where pupils need to feel they're at peace and they're not being watched, which didn't go down well with Ofsted, but I was proud of the school for taking a stand on that. So really welcome the resource that MEND are producing on places to pray in the school. So there's all of those things happening. And at the structural level as well, we have the leadership of our government, especially with a prime minister who refers to Muslim women as looking like letterboxes or bank robbers. That immediately gave rise to a spike in hate crime and anti-Muslim attacks, with many women reporting hijabs being ripped from their heads and being attacked on the street. So what happens at a structural level has a direct impact at a cultural and a personal level. And it's like people feel that it's okay, that it's normalized to be anti-Muslim because that's coming from our leadership. So when we're going to tackle Islamophobia, what we need to take care about is that we tackle it at all three levels. You can never eradicate Islamophobia if you just tackle individual instances. We need to be tackling it at cultural levels and at structural levels. And that's why it needs to be a concerted campaign in order to do that. I suppose the other thing that I wanted to say was that we have something called an anti-racist framework, which we've pushed out to every school. And that framework has 5 sections in it on leadership, teaching and learning, voice and power, well-being and belonging, and community and context. And what we're trying to do is say to a school, if you want to tackle racism, if you want to tackle Islamophobia, you have to take a whole school approach. You have to look at your leadership, you have to look at your teaching and learning, the voice and power of pupils and staff, how they feel, their well-being and belonging, and also what's happening in their community. As Samir said, the Trojan horse example is a great one for what the impact on communities and then in the school and what that meant politically. So I suppose that I'd want to end by saying that Islamophobia, we know, blights the lives of children and young people. And we really must challenge it. The growth of any one form of racism permits other forms of racism to re-emerge. And we must do all we can to ensure Islamophobia does not become respectable racism, but is tackled rigorously in all our schools and communities. And I hope that the National Education Union can be part of that solution and can support MEND in their efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen, especially your point around when Ofsted had asked for the prayer room to be monitored. A prayer room is a place where you can breathe and let your guard down, and for that to be taken away reinforces the damaging psychological effects Surya explained earlier. So for the school to stand with the student means a lot. Thank you so much for your support. It is strongly appreciated and life-changing. We will now move on to the Q&A section, and we'll open up the floor for all speakers. So if all speakers can put on their cameras for the Q&A, that would be great. As we wait for the speakers to put on their cameras, we will start with asking a question to Surya. Surya, you mentioned about your life experiences. How has it been recently after founding the Equality Act Review? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, could you just expand a little bit? Do you mean my experience in the classroom or with the Equality Act Review?
The latter.
The latter. Okay, so actually setting up the Equality Act Review was actually informed by my experience in the classroom and the subsequent navigation of the legal system as a litigant in person. So they're not exclusive of each other. One is largely informed by the former. What we do at the Equality Act Review is, as an academic, an anthropologist by training, I weave in and use anthropological methods, ethnography in particular, to study certain events, certain trends, and provide kind of nuances beyond the statistic. And a lot of policy is based on and premised on statistics, 85% of this or 50% of this, but actually what we don't hear is the life experience of students, for example, the extracts that are provided on Muslim women, or people living in tower blocks, for example, in marginalized communities, and put those experiences, those interview extracts, were really at the forefront of policymakers. So at the Equality Act Review, we bridge research and policy and try and minimize or mitigate for the length of time that research takes to be translated into policy, which then gets translated into real life impact on the ground for the communities in need. So that's our aim at the Equality Act Review. And we're completely non-funded, completely voluntary organization, and we're going 3 years now, 3.5 coming to about 3.5 years, set up in 2018. And we work with, as I mentioned, we've worked with the Department of Education and across government, across MPs on both sides of the House, and have regular communications and briefings with them. And also we've disseminated our research findings in the media as well.
Thank you. Question for Samir. In your opinion, if there's one thing someone can take away from today's session, what would that be?
Sorry, Mariam, could you repeat that?
In your opinion, if there's one thing someone can take away from today's session, what would that be?
Okay, so having listened to these really amazing speakers, I think one of the greatest things that I will be personally taking away, and I hope that other people may choose to take this away as well, in the sense that the work that we do is so important, and at whatever level you're doing that work, it's so important. So either as volunteers or, as people involved with government or with policy, or even just really giving resources to students and parents, that's really important. And another thing is that how crucial school life is, and to really support your children. And like, I have a toddler and she's just started nursery, and I'm like, oh my gosh, she's going to go through all of this, and I need to be ready and I need to be prepared and give her that preparation as well. and, you know, to really fight the system because of how important. And I think Dr. Surya's research really highlights all of that. And I think it's really crucial to be aware of that. So that's kind of what I would take away.
Thank you. A question for Karen. In your opinion, are schools doing enough to tackle Islamophobia?
No, in short, but it's not. I don't think it's the teachers that are the problem. Our teachers, by and large, when we've worked with them, are really keen to do something on anti-racism and anti-Islamophobia. Where there is a problem, I think, is the failure of government to recognise the need to do this, and a curriculum which doesn't allow for it. That's why we want to do a curriculum review, and also initial teacher education courses which don't prepare teachers well enough. So they're really reliant on doing their own self-education, which many of them do. And so we also want to look at, you know, what's happened with privatization and academization of schools is there's much more freedom for them about what they do. And that's led to kind of very ad hoc ways of tackling Islamophobia and racism. So, you know, there's a problem of privatization as well. And we really would like to do more to encourage and help teachers, support schools to take these agendas forward.
Thank you. And just to expand on that, Karen, what do you think is holding schools back from adopting these recommendations in order to deal with Islamophobia?
Which recommendations, Mariam?
For example, teaching, adding Islamophobia to teach within school lessons, not just in history, but on a day-to-day basis.
Everywhere, yeah. I mean, so just from what I've seen, what's holding them back is just having the confidence to do it. So they need support to do it. They need the guidance from leadership. They need leadership to say, we want you to do this, and this is how you can do it. This is where it's built in the curriculum. And we want the government to be able to do a review of the curriculum, say this is how we can tackle all forms of racism and Islamophobia within the curriculum. So, you know, different ways: leadership of the school, initial teacher education, government and the national curriculum, making sure assessment systems are fair, because at the moment they're very unfair. There are algorithms which kind of mitigate against disadvantaged pupils, especially those on low income. So we need to, all of those levels need to be addressed.
Thank you. A question for Surya. Do you believe there has been change as a result of your efforts and research? And if so, do you mind giving some examples, please?
Yeah, I think change, well, firstly, change doesn't happen overnight. You know, change, it takes, you know, generations sometimes. And sometimes change happens after our lifetime. You know, it doesn't happen in our lifetimes. What I can say that, at least for our children, as Samir mentioned earlier, our children, their children, we can always fight for a better tomorrow. We can always fight for a better future for them. And hopefully one day in our history classes, they'll be taught about the struggles that our generation of Muslims and our parents' generation of Muslims, of minorities within this country experience, and the struggle and the hardship. In terms of examples around change, it's actually really heartwarming when ministers engage with our research, and ministers take away from our recommendations, and they recognize that this is not only a valid piece of research, but it's also an important one that they can draw on to make effective policies. Now, it might not be that they take all 10 of 10 recommendations on board. It might be that they take 1 or 2, but that it's while it's small, and sometimes, you know, some people might say, well, that's you know, ineffective, but actually it might just be the one that is really needed. So for example, recently we had a meeting with the DFE over the summer Department of Education, and some of the recommendations that we'd mentioned were taken on board and had already been implemented prior to attending that meeting. So that's something that I really kind of, at least within myself, celebrated. I thought that was quite an important milestone. It's not something that you can see, it's not something that's measured on the outside, because policies kind of work and policy implementation, there's a lot of being and behind the scenes work that goes on before the policy actually gets to the front line. So I was really pleased to be part of that process. And I was really pleased that Equality at Review is part of that process in terms of research with inequalities and minorities experience.
Thank
And
you.
will continue to do so.
For Samir, was there any challenges in creating the Easy Read Guide? Sorry, your mic's on mute.
Gosh, I really hope that wouldn't happen today. It did. One of the things that I and the people that I worked with, we found really difficult is figuring out what to put, what not to put, because there's a wealth of information out there, and you think, and when you see something, you're like, oh, that would really help to kind of get this information across better, or parents would really need to know that. But then there's something more important that you need to add in. So I think it's really, because it's an easy read guide and it's not a report, it's really about highlighting the most relevant but important information that will kind of maximize and give parents and students you know, the really kind of the full understanding of what they need and how they need to tackle this. And I think the other thing was, this was my first easy read guide, and I think this is one of the first things I did as junior researcher. So for me, it was really an expose into kind of the kind of systems that we have in this country to really promote fairness and equality, and how very little they are followed. And that really is kind of a huge shock. It was a huge shock for me, and it was and since then I've come to realize that there's a lot of that you know is there. So it was yeah, it was kind of just figuring out, you know, what to really put on there, as well as coming to terms with all that information and all of that knowledge. So but alhamdulillah, it was a lovely process, and you know, we have the final product.
Well, definitely, it's supposed to be an easy read guide. I think if we start adding too much, it can put people off. So
yes, exactly, that balance.
Definitely. A question for Karen. There's a new trend on schools becoming academies. How do you feel about this new trend, and how do you think this impacts conversations around anti-Islamophobic work in schools?
I mean, I think I kind of already mentioned it, that we're quite concerned about the academization of schools, because they have much more freedom to do what they want, and they're not under the auspices of a local authority who can actually prescribe what goes on in their area. So they have much more independence, and that's a bit worrying, because we have to influence what they do. Having said that, I do know of some really good academies who have used their freedom to actually do more than they would have done before on race and racism. So it's not across the board, but we are concerned that there isn't a kind of democratic process and a national system of being able to ensure that all schools tackle racism and Islamophobia.
Yeah, Mariam, is it possible if I can just come in on that question?
Yeah, definitely.
Just kind of echo what Karen said, and thank you, Karen, for all of your contributions. I've learned so much, and I really want to keep in touch with both of you and kind of carry on the conversation.
Me too.
My experience kind of being sacked from a school, it was actually an academy. And I think a lot of, so let me explain briefly what had actually happened. There was a video of 9/11, a graphic video of 9/11 with an 18 rating caution message shown at the beginning of the video. And the teacher, a white British teacher, continued to play the video. And the group of children, the students, were 11-year-olds. They had just started secondary school. It was their second week, a Tuesday, second week of their first time in secondary school. and they were being taught GCSE curriculum. And bear in mind, some of them, not all, some of them had additional learning support needs. And this academy was freely teaching 11-year-old students a lower band GCSE content in their second week of secondary school, which shows the complete overhaul of structures. Sometimes structure, I mean, people criticize structures, but I mean, to be teaching GCSE content to 11-year-olds who just started school was quite extreme, I thought, let alone the video that was used. So that's just one example of the freedom. And I'm just going to say it's an abuse of power that goes on in academies. There's so much abuse of power, you know, from the amount that CEOs get paid to, you know, the in my experience in particular, the inexperience of the HR personnel, which a HR department was one person who basically didn't know that I was being sacked and that was against my contract. So from, you know, the whole employment process, there was just complete, you know, distaste towards processes, legalities, legal requirements for staff and students. You know, I mean, come on, safeguarding 18 rated portion video being shown to 11-year-olds. There's a complete disregard for all these things. And I think academies are bad news, to be honest. And I do accept, as Karen said, and I said that this in my presentation at the beginning, there's a caveat. What I'm saying is not applicable to all teachers, all schools, everywhere, but we have to recognize there is a pattern. And it's these patterns that I'm speaking about and speaking to. And I think, broadly speaking, academies are bad news for people and our community in large as well.
Thank you, Samir. All the other questions have been answered during the webinar, so we're going to end the Q&A there. Unless there was any final comments that anyone would like to make.
Just thank you to everyone. It's great to hear from the other speakers, and thank you to MEND.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting this really important discussion, MEND.
I echo those sentiments. It was a pleasure to be on a panel of such distinguished speakers. So yes.
Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you found this really beneficial insight. We'd like to encourage parents, staff and schools to engage with our Easy Read guides, which can be found in the description box of this webinar. I hope everyone has a lovely evening. Thank you for joining.